Start. So we've got to have a fascinating new topic to deal with today, and that is the whys of Judaism as it relates to birth and the circumcision and the bris. Before we start, I want to say a special thank you to Rosemary. First of all, welcome back from Israel. And Rosemary is sponsoring because we just passed Erwin Urchi's yard site, which was just last week. Purim for Mordechai for Mordechai Fish, and in honor of twin great-grandchildren to Rabbi and Mrs. Zachari Rosenthal of Manhattan. So the thinking backwards and thinking forwards. It's so wonderful to have you back. Be'ezrat Hashem, you should have continued simcha as well. Be'ezrat Hashem, getting out during a war, but Baruch Hashem, the Jewish people continues. It's amazing to celebrate with you. Let us learn a little bit of Torah. So here we go. There's so many interesting questions which I'm sure people have considered, but I'd like to just to open them up. First of all, why is it a mitzvah to have children? It's an interesting thing. In fact, this is the earliest mandate given to the human being, if you think about this, which is why the Sefer HaChinuch quotes this as the first mitzvah in all of the Torah. The first thing Hashem says in Bereshis, Perek Aleph, is Hashem says, "Vayivorech Hashem Elokim, vayomer lahem, pru urevu umilu es haaretz kivshua." Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and conquer it or bring it under your dominion. There's a mitzvah. Why is this particularly a mitzvah? Why is this the first thing that the Almighty said to a human being? So the first thing is very clearly is Hashem does not want a desolate world. Hashem wants a world which is going to be perfected, which is going to be enhanced, which is going to be uplifted, as some would say, enabled and ennobled, to make it an elevated place. The way it's said in the prophet in Yeshayahu is Lo tzahu bara, lo sheves yetzara. Hashem did not leave it to be empty, He wanted it to be settled. Which, by the way, just in case you're wondering, although the mitzvah of Puruvu, technically speaking, according to the way we paskin, is to have a girl and a boy, but technically speaking, there's still a mitzvah to continue to have children. That is from Yeshayahu, which is Lo tzahu bara, lo sheves yetzara, la erev al tanach yadecha, which is Hashem wants us to continue to have children as is possible, to be able to populate the world. Hashem wants the world to be a populated place. Hashem wants the world to be cultivated. But there's more to it than even that. Number one is I think, and it's not I think, but this is the argument I would make, is that having children is the greatest sacrifice a person can really make, if you think about it. Right? I once did a financial accounting to figure out how much money is spent on a child between the age 0 and 18, right? Now I did it a few years ago, but I was in the mid 800,000s. If I was working out correctly, I was in the mid 800,000 for one child, right? Just in terms of just doing all the cheshbons with it. So it's just the hospital fees, then all the associated, the food costs, the school costs, the camp costs, the clothing costs. There's so much that goes into a child. And by the way, that's the easy part. The financial part, right? Now try to quantify the energy and the pain and the sacrifice and the time. I mean, it's beyond quantification as to how much a parent gives to a child. The greatest giving a person does in life is to bring a child into this world because it's at the cost of one's own comfort. I always remember, I was at a rest stop once, and the rest stop had an advert for contraception. And the advert said, "When life just can't wait." And what that meant is that you are living. You're going, in the summers you're going on your yacht. After work you're going to the bar, and now here comes along somebody else who's going to make demands of your time. You can't just do what you want whenever you want, right? And that's when your life can't just wait. Now I always say to myself, sort of unfortunately, is that when you have children, and children are seen as such, as their interruptions to your life, then when you get old enough, they will put you in the nursing home because when life cannot just wait. It goes both ways. But nonetheless, so the point is that if giving a child is the greatest sacrifice, thank God young parents aren't told this, right? Because they have no idea of the fine print when they bring a child into the world, but it's a huge amount of investment. It's the greatest investment that we can possibly make, which is why things like Yibum are seen as a very, very noble act, right? A noble act where you're giving of your child to essentially a deceased relative, right? And I think I find it very meaningful when 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 they have their own children, when they name after somebody else in the family, they weren't asked to, right? I always see it as a mini type of yibum in a certain sense, where they're saying, and that person mattered enough in my life to continue that. I think that's a very profound element, because they're essentially sacrificing everything, and that person is in their name of that person. That's a very profound sacrifice. And Judaism encourages us to be givers in a society which is completely self-focused. And so having children is precisely this as well. I would also argue another reason that this is so profound is because I believe that having children is essentially a hope in the future, right? It is very plausible right now for us to sit around and have coffee and say, I don't think today's world is a world that I would be comfortable growing up in, right? I am happy that my wife was just at a work party, and they did a throwback. So the work party was the 90s theme, right? And again, I know it sounds young and so on, but the 90s was a good time, right? It was before smartphones. It was before all the wars in the Middle East. There was, the worst was Monica Lewinsky, right? That's what we're dealing with, It's like, it was a much simpler time. If you think about today, bringing up children in today's environment is so much harder than it ever was beforehand. It is plausible, and many people make this argument, I don't want to bring children into this world, which is why many people, in a certain sense, without even perhaps articulated, are saying life is not as worth living as it was. It's just very complicated. But Judaism requires us to bring children into the world, and the responsibility is because we actually do believe that history trends upwards, and that we believe there's hope at the end. I would just like to argue an interesting observation. And that is, just if you look around, you can do the research yourself. I was doing this just a few months ago, is the birth rate in the world right now. In all Western developed countries, birth rate is below replacement level, which means America right now is hovering around 1.6. Okay? So that's not 1.6 children, that means on average, that's what it looks like. Which means that and Europe has been lagging for a very, very long time. It's just America, unfortunately, has been sliding. America used to have a positive birth rate. In the past decades, it's been slipping. And that means to say is, unfortunately, other people are populating that space as well. So there's no vacuums when it comes to this. But the only Western developed country in the world right now which has a positive birth rate is Israel. Israel's birth rate is at 2.9. Which is almost double the average of the Western developed countries, which rests around 1.5. Which means, and this is so, people can make as much fun as they want of the Haredi world and so on, and poke fingers and but at the end of the day, having children is the greatest sign of hope in the future. That we believe that the world's a good place to live in, and Israel is the only Western country which is actually doing that right now. Which is something to be aware of. There's something to be proud of. There's something innately hopeful in Judaism. It's not by random that the anthem of Israel is Hatikva, which literally means the hope. Right? If you were to say what is the likelihood of Jews returning to their homeland 150 years ago, you'd put it at a 0.001. Right? But we don't believe in statistics, we believe in hope. And hope is how we've got to where we are. So having children is one of those, is a very, very profound sign of hope for the future. I remember actually Dr. Abramson has a very beautiful podcast with Open Door Media, which Open Door Media was Jerusalem United, putting out a lot of great stuff, like Israel, education. And so he was talking about the Holocaust, and people would say, how come the Jews did not fight back? Which is one of the classic questions. Why is there only one time the Warsaw Uprising? And his observation was, he made a very profound observation. He says the Jews did fight back, but in ways perhaps that are less expected. Which is, if you're aware of the Belinsky brothers, which is a whole famous thing. They went into the woods and they made a movie based on this, about a settlement they created deep in the novel. I don't know what the name of the forest was, with an N. It's deep in the forest, and the Nazis came and attacked them. One of the things they did was they opened a school, and his observation is that opening a school is only done if you actually believe there's going to be somebody else to go forward. Meaning, education thinking about the children is the greatest hope in the fact that there's going to be a future. It's not just about hand to mouth in terms of food. Very profound observation. Now, one thing which just as a curious question is, why is that when a baby is born, a human baby is completely helpless compared to most animal babies, right? So if you ever watched, the Nature Channel and you see a baby, deer, gazelle being born, it's amazing. It's born, it falls out, boom, and then 2 seconds later it's up on its legs, right? And it walks away. It's an amazing thing, right? So you say, no, it had to evolve that way because of the predators. It's like, yeah, but the humans also have a lot of predators as well, right? Why is it that a human being baby, comes out, they can't do anything. If you didn't pick them up and feed them every 3 hours, that's it. I mean, it's completely hopeless, can't ambulate, can't feed itself for a good 9 months at least, right? There's no self-care really, essentially, up to that point in time. Why is that? Why should that be? There's a lot of interesting theories. But one thing which is worthwhile, and by the way, the Midrash acknowledges this, is that the Midrash says that think about the way that the world was created. The world was created where the last part of creation was the human being, right? So in a certain sense, the Midrash says it's like the feast being prepared and then the guest arriving, right? So the world is seen as the human being as being the guest. In a certain sense, a lot of the necessary steps were done beforehand for the human being to survive, right? So the way the Midrash views it is that human beings are not just the crown of creation, but also the recipient of the creation. Now, some people take this too far, think about the bisons, right? But if you think about it, it's meant to be that the human being, in a certain sense, is somewhat vulnerable, is somewhat of a recipient, because it is the recipient of creation. So we'll call it, philosophically, it is seen as, so to speak, the weakest of creation. If you ever read the Sword and the Stone by T.S. White, right? It's actually a 4-part book. Most people only know the first part because they watch Disney. But there's actually 4 parts to it. It's called Camelot, the Once and Future King. The first part is called the Sword and the Stone. So in it, there's a very beautiful scene. I always come back to the scene. It's where Wart, which that's Arthur, is learning with Merlin, the wizard, as to what life is going to be, and he investigates what life is worthwhile living, and he investigates every creature, and each creature has its own defense mechanisms, and the mole has strong paws but weak eyes, and it goes through each creature what it has, and then the human being is like nothing, no fur, right? No claws, right? No tail, like none of the stuff, but it has wisdom, right? So that's sort of the process of understanding what the human being has, but still it seems to be that there's a lot missing. There is a theory, which I thought was really fascinating. I actually came across this when I was first reading Rabbi Kellerman's book, To Kindle the Soul, which is really, really fascinating book. He cites some research which has argued. There's a doctor called Dr. Balbli who argues that human beings undergo what's called exogestation, which means the human being is actually the emergence into this world is still in the middle of their gestation, which means that they are still in utero outside of the uterus for the first 9 months of their life, right? Which means that the human being's gestation period really is meant to be 18 months, but it needs to come out in the middle of that process. Why? And the argument is because the human being's attachment requires love and physical and emotional connection and attachment during that period, which can only be achieved during the first period of life, which is when attachment is formed. Which means, just think about that for a profound observation, the child is really only born then, essentially, only becoming independent at the point of real birth, which is later on, around 9 to 12 months into its life, but the first 9 months are critical parts of exogestation. That's a very profound way of rethinking the whole process, as opposed to an animal that's fully born and fully functional. That's because it doesn't have that emotional, we'll call module. The human being does, which is why it's so critical. They did a lot of research, unfortunately. A lot of research was done on the kibbutz system of children's homes or children houses, where the parents would take their children and they would put them into a nursery where all the other children in the kibbutz would be, and there would be monitors. There was nothing irresponsible about this. There'd be monitors who'd be in charge, as there would be a rotation of volunteers who would be, their job would be looking after the children, and if the children were to cry, they'd put them back to sleep, and there'd be a whole room of babies. And unfortunately, they traced that because this is done from the 1950s. It took them until the 1990s to actually document this and understand all the incredible harm that was done through that. You say, well, what harm is there? They were being looked after. No, there was no child that was malnourished. There was no child that was left to cry. Yes, but it wasn't the mom. It wasn't the dad who was getting the child. And those children had significant issues. It's very fascinating to read the report in terms of drug abuse, in terms of psychological issues that they dealt with, the development of schizophrenia. Many issues are related to lack of attachment because their parents weren't there. Which means to say, and by the way, in the 1990s was the last kibbutz to close down their children's home as a function of this of these reports, because it doesn't work. A child needs a parent, and it's such a profound observation in terms of the development of the human being as opposed to the animal being, which something which we as much as we're living in a world which sort of just treats us like animals, we're not animals. One of the questions which is worth asking is, why is birth such a painful process? It's not fair for a man to ask that question, but having witnessed a number of births, the world would certainly not be populated if it was men doing this, right? So we're not going there. So why is this? The truth is that I don't know if this is the case in the animal kingdom. Because animals don't express pain in the same way that human beings do. But I don't know if that's the case in the animal kingdom, but we do know that in the beginning of Bereshis, in Perek Gimel, we do know that the outcome of the Chet Eitz Hadas had a number of ramifications. And the Torah tells us, so the Torah says that in Etzev you will have children. Etzev is usually translated as the word which means sadness. But actually Rav Hirsch in his commentary makes the observation, there's a number of letters that are usually interchangeable in Hebrew. One of them is Tzadi and Zion, okay? Actually come from the same, all the interchangeable words of Rav Hirsch are all in the same area of the verbal word, the vocal expression. So there's actually 5 areas, right? There's the throat, there is the palate, there's the tongue, there's the lips, and there's the teeth. Those are the 5 different areas. So for instance, gikak, that's gimel yud kuf, is chaf kaf is on the palate, right? Bumaf, those are plosives, those are on the lips. So all the different reya ha'ach is all the throat, right? Those are, so if you're learning all these different areas that come from different areas. So Rav Hirsch actually points out that etymologically all the words that have interchangeable words in the same place of pronunciation actually have connection to each other. So Etzev tel dibanim is the same word as Ezov. Ezov means to leave, to relinquish. So he points out that the process is a process of renunciation, of self-sacrifice, right? So when a mother brings a child into this world, she's sacrificing her own body in a certain sense, right? Somebody else is growing in one, right? And there's so much sacrifice. It's not just teldi. He points out that teldi means to say is bringing up as well. There's this element of sacrifice that a person is one leaving behind so much in order to make space for another. It's interesting that in the next pasuk it describes that the work of man is going to be bi'itzavon. Interesting. So his work, is going to be the sacrifice he's going to have in the field, and hers is the sacrifice in the child raising. It's interesting in today's day, I was speaking about this with my wife, and she pointed out, today, the wives do both, right? So meaning to say, they're doing the work, and they're doing the child raising as well. So I said, you're right, but some of the dads are trying to also do both as much as possible, even though they don't have the right equipment, but they are trying as best as they can to step in. So there is sort of a merging which is going on around now, but the notion is be'izavon or be'itzavon. There's this notion of sacrifice involved in the child raising process, which is so much more than it ever was beforehand. Eliezer?
I just want to comment to why the family unit that was years ago was much easier for the mother, and having the grandparents and great-grandparents all around led to less postpartum issues and to more help, which eased the process. Today, because of the disparity and the people are all spread all over the place, you don't have that unit anymore. And that makes a very big difference. I've seen in children who are married, who move in with their families and live with their families. It's a much different dynamic than parents growing up that don't have that extra help.
Agreed. It works on the other end as well, which is also aging as well. So unfortunately, if you, I remember I went to visit a farm in Pennsylvania. The kids all like the fun things and the rides and the ice cream, and then I'm like looking at the old farmhouse and and so they were showing us like how the family used to live. There was the bed. Mom and dad slept in the bed, and the kids slept around them in the same bed, and just to keep the warmth. And then grandma was at the foot, and it was one big happy tent, But it was much more simple in those days where people were together. You're right, but unfortunately, with the realities that we have today, with the realities we've created for ourselves, it's much more complicated. Let's go a little further. Why is there such a thing as a shalom zachar? So there's a few reasons. Interestingly enough, most people are not aware of this, but Rosh Hashanah actually writes an interesting observation. He says that having a child is a life-threatening process, right? It's a very, especially when one goes to the hospital and realizes how helpless one is. It's pikuach nefesh, and therefore it used to be the custom that the rabbi of the congregation would go to the mother on the Friday night when she'd after birth, and he would go and assure her, go through the laws that she is allowed to break Shabbos if she needs to, right? To go through the halachas of if this is pikuach nefesh, this is what's necessary. And it used to be, well, if the rabbi was going, then other people would come to wish Mazel Tov. But that one of the interesting observations is this was a function of the Shalom Zachar was specifically about the mother. Fascinating enough. There are other ideas. So as an example, the Gemara says, hang on just a second, the Gemara says, Ibaba Kama describes that it's called Yeshua Habein, which means the salvation of a child. What does it mean? So there was a great feast that was on the first Shabbos. Tosfos explains Yeshua can mean salvation from the dangers of childbirth, and it can also mean a thanksgiving that this child was born. So there's this notion of this thanksgiving su'udah of the birth of a child. There is also a medrash which describes that the marshal it gives is that a king declared that no guest should appear before him without visiting his royal matron first. That's the way the medrash describes it. Who's the royal matron? Is Shabbos, which means Hashem says, I'm going to bring this child into the covenant, but before I do, I need Shabbos to interact with this child before I get there. It's sort of almost like a protection agency that the child is ready for the bris as well. Have 1 second. The Gemara also gives another option, and that is that it describes that. It describes that when a child and a ben zachar enters the world, there is a peace enters the world, and there are those who say that this is perhaps the shalom zachar is a function. Everybody's invited, so even those who may have disagreement can come over and wish mazel tov and start anew. Which means that let's say there's an argument between neighbors, the shalom zachar is an opportunity when you know how this is. You could be in a really foul mood, and when you see a baby in the waiting room, suddenly you become a lot lighthearted. So a child enters, and you always had this problem for the last 10 years with your neighbor, and they put on their music and they do the things, and then they have a baby. It's your opportunity to go over and sort of make amends. Another option that the Gemara presents. And finally, the Gemara also makes the observation that the child is learning Torah in the womb. And so the loss of the Torah is a state of avelus, which is why we have this meal, because there's the loss of that Torah. Now you say to yourself, so why did the Sfaradim not do it? So the Sfaradim actually do something called a Brit Yitzchak, which is very profound if you've ever been to one. It's the night before the bris, not the Shabbos before. So and they have like a whole set. They go through Zohar and they go through a whole bunch of things, and Midrashim and Mishnayos, and it's all read the night before. There's a set framework, and everybody breaks it up and they say their parts. It's the same idea, which is a child's about to have a bris and needs protection. So at this point in times of protection, especially when there's spiritual tension or friction to get there, that's when this is given. So why is it that girls don't get shalom zachar? So that's a good question. And so it depends on the reasons. Meaning, according to the reason that really it's the mom who needs to hear about the halachas of Shabbos, then technically speaking, it should be both ways. But if we're talking about the idea of let's go back through the ideas. If it's the idea of Thanksgiving, that should be the same with the girl as well. If it's the greeting Shabbos before the bris, that's not applicable to a girl because the girl's not going to have a bris, so she doesn't have a shalom zachar. If it's the meaning of loss of perfection of Torah, that's a good question. Is she learning Torah in the same way? Never had a good answer to that as to what that Torah is and what was lost. If it's time for reconciliation, it could be a girl as well, which is why many people have a Simchas Bas or Zevet Abbas. I would just say like this, is that a girl's simcha is so much more tzanua than a boy's simcha. Think about this for a second. Who wants the entire world in your house, like 3 days after you've given birth? I mean, it's the most, difficult time to have anybody in your house. Or anybody around. So if you have a girl, you make the Simchas Bas when you want to. Don't make it at the same week. It's like ridiculous. Give it a month, give it 6 weeks. Make sure all the family can come and it's convenient, and you make a big deal then. You have a kiddush or whatever else it is you do. It's great, right? That's so much easier than the Shalom Zachar and the Bris. And who wants to take out their kid at 6:30 in the morning to have a medical procedure in public when the doctors told you not to take them away? So take it easy. It's much easier to do it with a girl, and it's reflective of it being a much easier simcha later on. What should I serve at the Shalom Zachar? Why? So there's a few things that people serve. One is people do serve arbes, which is chickpeas, and that's because of the shape, which is for the notion of avelus, of the loss of the Torah. It should be a time of zmiros. It should be a time of divrei Torah, not just drinking and talking, because it's a time of giving protection to that child. Now, let's move to the bris itself. Why is it that we do a bris? So the reason is because the Torah tells us. So the Torah says, "Vayom hashmini yimol b'sar lasa." That's the pasuk in Parshas Tazria, which we're about to get to as well. But having said that, there are a number of reasons which are suggested. So the Sefer HaChinuch, who comments and he gives the whys of the biblical mitzvahs, the Torah mitzvahs, explains that it is to demonstrate that we are physically distinct and unique from the nations of the world, right? And this is the case, by the way. You know, when the Nazis wanted to figure out who's who, they examined the Bris Milah, right? So this has been a stamp upon the body that a Jewish male is going to be different to the males of the world around them. That's number one. But another idea is that it relates to a person's mission in life. If you think about this is the conversation that's had between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus. Turnus Rufus was the one of the Roman procurators around who governed Judea, and he had a relationship with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva asked him, or actually that way around, Turnus Rufus asked him, what is better? Is the act of God better or the act of human beings? So, you'd expect a very frum rabbi to say, God is much better, right? But he said, no, the act of humankind. Why? He said, well, what do you prefer, bread or wheat? Right? So bread is clearly more processed, so therefore it's better. So that's the way that Rabbi Akiva presented the case. Turnus Rufus then said, I was about to ask you about Bris Milah, because why is it that you have a perfect baby and now you mutilate the baby? So Rabbi Akiva says, no, that's the point. Hashem produces an almost perfect world and allows us to perfect it, which is the way we start life. Right? Apparently it's interesting that applies more to men than women, which then in a certain sense describes that women are born a lot closer to perfection than men, and in terms of the mandate as well. Just interesting to think about. But nonetheless, meaning what we do is we start this child's life saying life is going to be about perfecting everything you see around you because it's not there quite there. I'm on the way. Another possibility is the idea of altruism. So, the Gemara describes this. This is my favorite Torah about this, is the Gemara in Menachos Daf Mem Gimel tells us that David Melech came to the bathhouse and he felt naked from all the mitzvahs because he was taking off all his clothes. No tefillin, no tzitzis, no lulav, no shofar, nothing. And then he realized he was Bris Milah. So he felt comforted. So biologically that is true. But why would that be the case? Why would David Melech feel so elevated by this? So I saw Rav Baruch of Mezhebush makes the observation that when a person goes to the bathhouse or to the Beis HaKisei in the Gemara, it oftentimes is referring to a process of re-evaluation. A person's looking in the mirror and, so to speak, examining one's own self. And when a person takes off one's clothes, what he's describing is he's taking off his interests, his bias. Everything we do have a bias, and whether we know it consciously or subconsciously, is I'm trying to impress so and so. It would be improper if I didn't do it such in a way because of the way people would think. There's so many interests that we have in the way that we act, and he was taking off his so to speak all his actions, all his mitzvahs, even his good actions, and he said, "There's nothing I'm doing here which is purely altruistically for the sake of it. It's always because of some image I've created for myself which I need to uphold." And he felt, therefore, that everything he did was somewhat diluted until he came to the Bris Milah. and he realized that was the only altruistic part of his entire life. Why is that? This is because he didn't do it to himself. Right? It was the only mitzvah. He was too young to have a bias when at the time it was given to him, which is a profound observation. So I would like to add on to that, and I saw this in Sefer Tamim Menagim, who says that's what it means. Is we're saying, let that altruism, let that purity of thought in this mitzvah be the way that carries them through the rest of life as well. There's a profundity in that experience as well, which I don't think is well known. Another perspective is that it is also a reflection of the greatest expression of continuity. Meaning, who is the bris? Who's really responsible for the bris? Technically speaking, if a father doesn't do it, then the basin have to do it. If the basin doesn't do it, the person has to do it themselves. So many people came out of Russia and they suddenly realized we don't have bris millers, so they went and they had to take care of it themselves, right? So it ultimately is one's own responsibility, but it's a responsibility that a parent does on one's behalf, which means the way we begin a new generation is by the old generation, so to speak, taking responsibility for the first steps of the next generation, which also clicks in. What was that? Good question. So Tzipporah seemed to take it very seriously, right? So it's interesting. In halacha, it's written the father, but it's very clear that Tzipporah took that step in that regard. And sometimes there are no dads, right? So I would say on equal standing there. But nonetheless, it's this sort of connection between generations, right? Each generation starts with the previous generation. Paying forward in a certain sense, and that's what Judaism is. Judaism is continuing that. I think it's when children decide to be a little more loose with their Jewish observance, to me it's so painful. Not in the sense, not even just because they're leaving a Judaism they never discovered, right? But also part of it is just the irresponsibility to tradition. Meaning, you're not just you. You have so much responsibility because of your grandparents and great grandparents. How could you possibly not take seriously what so many people sacrifice to get to you? There's a very, very huge incumbent responsibility in this process, and Bris Milah sort of signifies the beginning of that clicking into the tradition as well. Now, why is Bris Milah only for boys? So physically speaking, it's just generally a little easier to in that respect, because the boys do have an extra layer of skin which can be taken off. However, there are philosophical reasons as well. One example is that the Moreh Nevuchim Rambam says is that specifically the Bris Milah is to temper the sexual drive, and that seemed to be more of an issue on the male side of the spectrum than it is on the female side of the spectrum. Another reason is that there is that all impurity from the sin of we know that all tumah and all impurity comes from the sin of Adam and Chava at the beginning, the Adam and Eve sin, and a man's impurity is removed by removing the foreskin, the bris milah, whereas a woman's impurity is by immersing after giving birth. In a certain sense, biblically, both the mother and her baby are purified on the same day, on the 8th day. Right? If you read the actual psukim, right, there's the 7 days of impurity of the woman after childbirth, then mikvah. And the baby, in a sense, has the milah. There's a parallel in terms of the purification process as well. Why is it on the 8th day? So the reason is because the Torah tells us, but it is worthwhile noting biblically in the Torah that there's another parallel, which is that a korban may not be brought to an animal that's below 7 days old. It can only be on the 8th day, and that's because there's a sense of viability, that the child, this animal is actually a viable child. The Zohar explains this because that's the time that every child will always have a Shabbos. So no matter when a baby's born, there'll always be a Friday night, which is the matronissa, the matron, which is going to experience. So even if a child's born on a Shabbos morning, it'll still have a Friday night, the next Friday night, right? There's always going to be a Friday night before the bris as well. Why is there a kisei shel Eliyahu, right, at the bris? So the Avudraham comments on this, and he says, it's a very, very fascinating thing. If you read Melachim, Aleph, Perek Yod Ches, that's where Eliyahu runs away. After the Har Carmel episode, he runs away, he is persecuted by Izebel, and he runs to Har Sinai, of all places. And it's there he has this unbelievable conversation with the Almighty, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Malach Eliyahu, what's going on? And Eliyahu says, Kanoi kinesi la'Hashem l'kei tzokos. I am being zealous on behalf of you, Hashem, because they did not keep your covenant. That's what he says. So then Hashem says, demonstrates a fire and an earthquake and a wind, and says, I'm not found in any of those. I'm found in silence. And then he says, what are you doing here, Eliyahu? And Eliyahu verbatim repeats the same pasuk. And Hashem was trying to educate him that there's a big gap between ideals and human beings, right? We live that on a daily basis, right? So there's a very big gap between what Hashem aspires for and what human beings are actually realistically doing. And Eliyahu was, in a certain sense, putting his foot down and saying, I can't live with that gap, right? He repeats verbatim, Kanai kinesi, I am zealous because they did not keep your covenant. He declared a drought across the 3 years in the northern kingdom. And that was because people weren't listening. It says, Vayom shemati shmuel mitzvah asher anachim mitzaveschem hayom, right? And then it describes, I'll give rain. It says, these people aren't doing it, so he stopped the rain. And then that led to the showdown at Har Carmel. Ultimately, he was persecuted after that. And what he's essentially saying is, Hashem, I'm just doing what you said. I'm reading the Torah. I'm applying it to those folks. They're not doing it right. So therefore, I'm following through with all the curses that were associated with not doing it. And Hashem is essentially saying to him is, yeah, but your bar is too high for the reality of the human being that you're dealing with, right? And Eliyahu responds, I'm sorry, I'm still doing your bar because they're not keeping your covenants. So the Avodram says, is the Medrash explains that at that point in time, that's when Eliyahu was dismissed from his service. That's when Hashem says, find a new king, find a new prophet. That's when he finds Elisha. Because at this point in time, Eliyahu is seen as too much of a firebrand in terms of the ideals to apply it to the complexity of the human beings that he's dealing with. Right? The gap is too big. He can't understand the rudimentary, unwashed masses that he deals with. So ultimately, Elisha is chosen in his stead. But the Medrash says that therefore he's sent to every bris milah. Why? Because you claim that the Jews are not going to be keeping the bris. I will show you that they will keep a bris. And it reminds me, my favorite story about brises, I mentioned this before, but I do want to remind you, is the story of Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. That he writes in his autobiography, where he describes how he used to do many missions to the USSR. And when he went to the USSR, he'd bring all kinds of things, tefillin and tzitzis and amazing stories. And he describes that one day, it was in the middle of the night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he gets a knock on his door. And there's this fellow who wants him to come because they want to do a bris milah. And but the bris milah they're going to do in the cemetery, so that they're not going to be seen by the KGB. So he says, I can help you, but I'm a Kohen, I can't go into the cemetery, I'll come with you. So they go through the back streets and the shadows, and they get to the cemetery, and they go off into the cemetery, and Riskin's waiting there on the side, and they go off, and the moil goes into the cemetery with the baby, and they do the bris milah, and they come out, and Riskin says, wow, kashem shenichlas the bris kaini kanas, the Torah l'chopel amazon Torah, and the father goes, niet kashem. I don't want it to be that my child is going to be entering into chuppah, hiding away, fearing for their life in a cemetery. I want them to be proudly Jewish. And then, of course, Rav Riskin ends the story, says that boy managed to get to Israel, and I was able to do Musar Kedushin in Yerushalayim. The full story as it comes around. But Niet Kashem. So Eliyahu says they're not going to keep the bris. Ooh, in cemeteries, they're going to be keeping the bris of Hashem, despite all the difficulties. And that's what's said. So we say, that's why Eliyahu Malach HaBris, Amen Lefonecha. So we say that we acknowledge Eliyahu is here at the bris as well. Which leads us to a fascinating observation. Just recently somebody showed me a Bnei Yissaschar, the Dinavah Rebbe, who observes that he quotes a medrash. I have not been able to find the medrash, but he quotes this medrash, which says that Eliyahu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, listen, I'm coming to a bris, but what happens if the parents of the child are just like not up to scratch, right? They're just not living the life that I'm coming here, and you asking me to observe this bris, and they're average to below average, right? So Hashem says, you know what? I'm going to be mechaper on the avonos for the period of the bris. So then Eliyahu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what about the guests? I mean, like you can have any maneuver walk in, right? So I'm going to be at the bris, and there's going to be so and so who just is completely deficient, has no moral compass, and they're walking into the bris, and I'm going to be there. So Hashem says I'm going to be mechaper for those who are going to be around the bris as well. Which I believe this midrash is one of the sources as to why it's so important to daven in a bris, not just because the child's cries are going up to heaven, but because there's a certain sense Hashem waves at that space when Eliyahu was there. There's a waving of, there's a reprieve of their experience as well. So a few other points over here. Why is it that we say, why is a person called the sandek, the person who holds the baby? What language is that exactly? So there is an interesting observation, which is that it is actually a acronym for Sanegor Naaseh Din Kategor, which is that there's seen as, in a certain sense, coming off of that idea that the Jews are continuing at pain of death, at risk, and at cost, are still continuing to do a bris milah, in a certain sense, is a protection agency against the critiques of it could be Eliyahu, it could be the Satan Samael, God forbid, that we say is that this Sunday, this person is holding the baby at this time of great sacrifice and is, in a certain sense, a protection agency against the din of the kategor, which is sanegor nase din kategor. Why is it that a sandik should only do a sandik once in one family? So let's say there's a bunch of sons that are born, the sandik should only be a sandik once in that family. It can be sandik to other families, but not only once in one family. And that is because, interestingly enough, the person who's a sandik is seen as almost like Kamaktir Katoris, like a person who brings the Katoris on the altar, and that's seen as a big segula, which is why a Kohen could only do that once in their lives, to be Maktir Katoris, to be the one to facilitating it directly, which is why there's a big, beautiful Koach HaBracha of blessing on that day, and it should be done only once in one's family as well. There's a lot of parallels between a bris and korban. In this case, it's Katoris, incense, but the notion of sacrificing when one doesn't feel like one wants to be giving one's child in this space is very profound observation in this respect. Why is it that we say the bracha of lachnisa shel brisa shel Avraham Avinu after the bris? Usually you say a bracha before you do it. If you listen to the way the brachas work, in an Ashkenazi bris it goes, the moil says the bracha on the milah, and then the father says lachnisa brisa shel Avraham Avinu afterwards. Once it's said that the bris has already happened, right? Because what happens is he takes the foreskin, he clamps it, so it's not touching the limb, and then the moment he says the bracha, already the skin is sliced, then the father says the bracha. That's how it works. It's already happened by the time the father is saying the bracha. Why is that? So the answer is because it's not a birkas hamitzvah, it's a birkas hashevach. It's reflecting HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, thank you for allowing us to have a covenant. Thank you for allowing us to do something to be part of our covenant with you. Why is it that there is an aleinu at the end of a bris ceremony? You're right. Why most people don't know this because they're busy talking. But actually, technically speaking, there is aleinu at the end of the bris. Why is that? So one of the observations which is made is because it includes the baby in the phrase which we say, "Shelo yasanaka goyei ha'aratzos." You did not make us like the nations of the world. That child is now subject to that phrase because they've now entered the covenant of Avraham Avinu. Up till now they weren't. So in a certain sense we're saying in the presence of that child, Hashem, thank you for making us distinct in this way as well.